What is going on, guys? And in today's lesson, we're just going to be talking about the Indigenous peoples and the main question of how did Indigenous peoples respond to the major development that was going on in the Arctic and Western area of Canada. So, if we look at a map of Canada today, we're looking at northern BC, the Yukon territories, that whole western part of Canada, the Arctic area. And during this time, it was considered a very valuable area because of all the resources that there were. So during the late 1800s, indigenous peoples in the Arctic and West came into increasing contact with the Europeans. The government wanted to expand its control over these territories and the indigenous peoples living there. The Arctic, like I was saying, has tons of resources. Plus, there was a trade route to Asia, which is along Alaska, where Alaska is today known as the Northwest Passage. And the West had vast amounts of land that the government wanted to develop into farms and towns, while the indigenous peoples in both territories faced pressure from the government to give up their land and to assimilate. So remember, in previous chapters, we were talking about assimilation, and assimilation just basically means the Europeans wanted them, the indigenous people, to become more European and speak their language and stop practicing their culture. So they wanted to protect their ways of life, their independence, and the right to their land. So there were Inuit whalers. Inuit are migratory hunter-gatherers. They follow the seasonal rhythms to hunt and harvest different animals and plants at different times of the year. Inuit hunted for subsistence, so meaning just having enough food in order to stay alive, rather than the commercial trade, and used every part of the animal. During the 1800s, Inuit would hunt seals in the fall and whales in the spring and caribou in the summer. In the mid 1800s, the European whaling industry reached its peak in the Arctic. Hundreds of whalers from Europe and the United States spent months in the Arctic every year, hunting whales to get products like the high demand whale oil for European markets between 1850 and 1890. Inuit living in the Arctic began to have more contact with the whalers as well as the explorers and missionaries who traveled further into their homelands. So the whaling and fox fur industries. So Inuit traded baleen and caribou skins, walrus ivory, fish, and dogs with European whalers in exchange for goods such as metal knives, needles, rifles, tobacco, cloth, and food. In time, some Inuit took jobs with the whalers. They worked as guides, ship pilots, navigators, translators, hunters, dog drivers, and garment makers. Besides trading goods, however, the Europeans also brought alcohol and illness. New diseases such as smallpox, along the chain with changes in diet, caused a decline in the Inuit population. By the end of the 1800s, the whaling industry began to decline, but with the fur trade in the Arctic, while the fur trade increased in the Arctic, traders moved into the Arctic in search of furs such as fox. Inuit had not been interested in hunting fox since they considered fox fur to be too delicate. However, the Hudson's Bay Company encouraged Inuit to hunt for Arctic fox since their fur was very silky. The company set up trading posts to facilitate this trade, and Inuit began hunting and trading furs to obtain the goods they were used to receiving from whalers. So, what similarities do you see between the Inuit whalers and the coureurs de bois of the fur trade? How do you think the decline of the whaling industry and the surge in the fox fur industry impacted Inuit migratory hunting traditions? Whether it be an increase in the whaling population and a decrease in the fox furs. So here is some wooden coastal maps. They would create their maps with pieces of wood and graph them out to show their maps through pieces of wood. Maps are graphic or visual representations of land and water, and maps can be used to define and assert borders, locate cities and towns, or show natural features of the land and water. When map makers, also called cartographers, create maps, they make choices about what to include and what to leave out, as well as what symbols to use. These decisions reveal what map makers know, what they value, and how they see the world. Map making was common and well developed in indigenous communities. For example, indigenous map makers often drew maps from memory in the ground, in snow, or on animal skins, bark, or wood. Inuit have a strong oral tradition, meaning they tell stories. Oral narratives kept by expert Inuit map makers were important in creating their maps. Most Inuit maps were not long lasting, so map makers were relied on for their memory of the land. Some Inuits did make long lasting maps from wood. Wooden coastal maps were created and used by Inuit in Greenland. These maps look distinctly different from non indigenous maps. The maps shown in figure E19 and E20 were carved to represent the landscape. So you can see that here in these two maps. What is the map maker trying to show in each? Which geographical features do you think the Inuit map maker considered significant? How can you tell? Now examine E20 using the same steps. Keep in mind your thoughts on the previous questions. So if you look here, it matches up with the coast. So they definitely value the coastal waters and the land near the water.